Ki Tetzi. Ki Tetzi, which simply means when you go. And Israel here is being sent out by God to engage God's enemies. If you recall, in many times we've discussed this, but in Genesis chapter 15, God said to Abraham on the very night that the covenant was established with Abraham, that your descendants will go into a land where they will experience 400 years of slavery. At the end of that period, in the fourth generation, he will bring them out because the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. Implying there that the people of Israel, the sons of Israel, after 4 centuries will come out to engage the Amorites. The implication is very clear. So we struggle sometimes to see Israel as an army of people that God is preparing to use to execute his purpose relative to the land of Israel and the Canaanites that had defiled the land. And we must always remember that the Canaanites had defiled the land of Israel. The land of Israel has a pre-existent value. From the very beginning, the land of Israel was God's land. And so the land was defiled by these worshippers of pagan gods, and Israel's purpose was to be an army of holy combatants that will come into the land and rid the land of the defilements. And that's the purpose of Israel. And what we're seeing tonight really has to do with what's referred to as mitzvot. Mitzvot. What's mitzvot? It's plural for mitzvah. What's mitzvah? Commandment. So tonight's Torah portion is putting a lot of emphasis on the commandments, the mitzvot. The root word there for mitzvah is savah. Savah. And the word savah means to lay a charge upon. To lay a charge, to command, and that's the root word of commandment. To lay a charge. So God has laid a charge upon the people of Israel to carry out his purpose relative to the Canaanites, the pagans. And I'm not going to go into a great bit of details about what the Canaanites were doing, but they were doing quite a bit to defile the land. Their worship involved the worst type of paganism. I mean the worst type. Again, we have children in the room, so I'm not going to get into how defiled the actions of the Canaanites were, but they were pretty defiling. And so God is preparing the people of Israel. He wants them to be a holy vessel to execute his purpose, his will. We must keep that in context, especially with tonight's Torah portion. It was, I think, in 2010 or 2011 maybe, Barack Obama made a statement about the Bible. He didn't make many statements about the Bible, but he made a statement around that time about the Bible and people who subscribe to the Bible. And the statement was very defaming, undermining, and he said something to the effect that people that cling to their guns and Bible are backward. And how can they venerate the Bible? How can they support the Bible? And he paraphrased from tonight's Torah portion. And the paraphrase that I'm talking about is having a son that's a son of Belial, and you put him outside, you put him out of your house and have the community stone him to death. So Barack Obama made reference to that scripture that's found in tonight's Torah portion, and he used it to undermine Bible believers and to actually undermine the Bible itself. Now, did he take that verse or that concept out of context? Now, I might want to defend the Bible, and therefore I would say for sure he did. But I mean it. He took it way out of context. I don't think it is possible or was possible for Barack Obama to have the greater perception that would have allowed him to see or to understand the context of that scripture. So we're going to talk about that tonight a little bit. So let's begin. So Israel's purpose is to put evil outside, to drive out the evil inhabitants of the land, and more so to purify the land, to ensure that the land would be holy. And so, this is Israel's purpose. Israel is functioning like Israel is to function like an orderly entity that brings about God's purpose in the land. And in regards to that, holiness is an absolute necessity. Holiness is absolutely necessity. Israel will not carry out God's purpose without holiness, being wholly given over to God, completely obedient to his commandments. And so let's talk about this. Well, let's go right to the one mitzvot or mitzvah that Barack Obama really slandered believers, Christians with. It's found in tonight's short portion, Deuteronomy chapter 21. I'm going to read 18 to 21. And let's take a look at that. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and his mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of the city, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious." The King James uses a word there for that person. He's a son of Belial. A son of Belial. What does that mean, a son of Belial? Whose Bible has that reference in it? Son of Belial. No one has a King James that says son of Belial? No? All right. So the son of Belial there is making a reference to the pagan god Baal. All right? And so son of Belial. But stubborn and rebellious, he will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death. So you shall remove evil from your midst, and all of Israel will hear of it and fear. Wow. What an incredible commandment, mitzvah. But if you have a son that's rebellious and stubborn, a drunkard and a glutton, and he will not listen, you take him outside the city, tell the elders, and they will stone him. Now let's look closer at this. Let's take a closer look at it. First of all, this is not a child. It is not a child that's being stoned. This is an adult. Drunkard, a glutton, son of Belial. It's not referring to a child. If you have an adult son or daughter that's behaving in this way, conducting themselves in this way, you admonish them. If they don't respond, then it becomes a community action, an issue that involves the entire community. What's the point? Well, the point is what it says there in verse 21. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death, so you shall remove evil from your midst, and all of Israel will hear it and fear. Now, again, first of all, this is not a child. You're not to grab your 12-year-old, pull them outside of the city, and have the elders stone them. Okay? Now, secondly, deterrence has always been a vital aspect of law enforcement. Always has been. In fact, if you don't have deterrence, you don't have order. Is that true, Judge?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Deterrence is an essential aspect of keeping order. So God here is speaking of deterrence. Deterring the community, deterring the spirit of rebellion, the spirit of Belial. Now, it's unfortunate that anyone should be stoned to death. But this is about holiness. And Israel remaining a holy people, accountable to God, and walking in holiness before all the nations. This is actually about being a witness to the nations. Israel has been appointed by God to be a light unto the Gentiles, to be a witness to the nations. How well would that witness go, would that witness be, if they were allowing the actions of Belial in their camps? If one person gets away with it, what will happen to the next house, the next community? What will happen? Before long, the actions of Belial is permeate in the camp of Israel. It is a deterrent, and it's an essential deterrent. So again, first of all, it's not referring to a child, it's referring to an adult. Another thing we ought to consider about this is the parents are not the one to stone him or her, but the community leaders. They're the ones that will carry out the act. You follow me? Now, does this apply to us? Can this possibly apply to us? In effect, yes. Absolutely, in effect, yes. We don't take our adult children who are sons and daughters of Belial and give them to, Larry, Willie, and Pastor Roger and have them stone them. But you can do things to deter the behavior, insisting upon what is right and holy, taking necessary action to quail that activity so that we can maintain the witness. So it's an absolutely appropriate commandment. It points to the responsibility of Israel. It also points to the necessity of holiness and the holiness of God. The people of God should not have sons of Belial running about in their community. Drunkenness, stubbornness, you see. We know the story very well of the two sons of Aaron, right? What were their names? Nadab and Abihu. What happened with them? Fire came from God and destroyed them before the entire camp of Israel. Why? Because they were not conducting themselves holy as they ought to have been. They were not being the proper witness that God has called them to be. You know what Jesus said, to whom much is given, much is required. The standard for accountability is much higher for those who have been given much. And in regards to Israel, much has been given unto them. The responsibility of being a light, being a nation of priests to all the nations. So the standard is higher. So that's one of the mitzvot that we find in tonight's Torah portion that's difficult to deal with. But you have to look at the essence and the reason for the mitzvah. What's behind it? What is God's intent? What is God attempting, or what is he working towards in regards to achievement? Ultimately is so that Israel would be wholly accountable to God, standing in a place of a perfect witness to the nations, reflecting again the holiness of God. Also, let's look at some more of these commandments, just a few of them. There's about 4 or 5 of them, maybe 6 of them I would like to take a look at. There's a lot of them in tonight's Torah portion, right? So you can go through these, all of the mitzvot, and some of them will cause you to ponder. Some of them will give you grief, and some of them you would say, I get that, but I want to just throw out a couple for you, and I'll offer you some understanding on it. In chapter 22, chapter 22, verse 22. If a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who laid with the woman, and the woman. Thus you shall purge evil from Israel. So it's referring to adultery. Adultery is completely unwelcome. And you're going to apply the standard of deterrence to adultery. That's what Israel is supposed to do. You cannot permit it. It is a sin that permeates. It's an iniquity that, if not brought under check, will proliferate in the camp of Israel. So you have to act very, very decisively concerning this particular sin. All sin is in that same place, but there are some sins that are stronger in the fallen nature, such as adultery, fornication, sins of sensuality. These transgressions, these iniquities are particularly dangerous in a community setting. So you have to act against it. How many of us have heard of churches where there was in fact adultery? being committed. And on the highest levels, what does that do for the kingdom of God? What does that do for the testimony of the believers? What does it do for the witness of Christ, Messiah Jesus, in his kingdom? It totally undermines it. It harms the reality of what our testimony should be. And there's not one example, but there are multiple examples of this. And what does that tell us? That perhaps we're a bit lawless. We don't have an appreciation for Torah, for the reality of law. Is there any person in leadership who would not be tempted in this regard? No. In leadership, you're going to be tempted in this regard because there are people who react a certain way to people in leadership. It's natural. It's natural, but it should never be accepted. The one in leadership should be particularly careful about this particular iniquity because the enemy, the evil one, will use it in an attempt to bring that leader down and defame God in every opportunity he has. Adultery, not to be tolerated, to be discouraged by extreme means. So let me see. Let's talk about in a church setting, a typical church setting, a minister, let's say an elder or a deacon or a pastor commits adultery. How do you create that deterrent? How would the church go about creating the deterrent? Now, we're not going to stone him and the person he committed adultery with, right? We're not going to do that. But how do we create an equally shocking deterrent? Defrocking, absolutely. Complete banishment. This person should be openly denounced and exposed. There should be no secrecy about it, no attempt to hide shame. There should be a complete exposure. Over the years, I've practiced this, and it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant to expose sin the way that I do. And there are some times when you have to hold off. But ultimately, it will come to light. Ultimately, it always comes to light. And it's essential in order for there to be a deterrent. You ought to never encourage something like this by just blinking at it. You take action. You take action. Sometimes the action is painful. It's grueling. It takes life out of you. But you have to do it. So that commandment, God's word to Israel is to create a strong, convincing deterrent. Stone the man and the woman. Also in chapter 23, 17 and 18, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute. What is it referring to? It's referring to the worship of Baal and the worship of Ashtoreth. Cult prostitution. Both male and female, by the way. So in ancient Israel, the Canaanites worshipped in this manner, where you would have temples, and the temples were nothing more than brothels. Of course, this was not for recreation, this was for religious purposes. This is how they worshiped their fertility gods and goddesses, namely Baal and Ashtoreth. So there was male prostitution and female prostitution. God is saying, stay away from it. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God for any votive offering, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. Needless to say, there is an intense deterrence attached to this particular sin. What is the deterrence? What did God commission the people of Israel to do with the Canaanites who were engaged in this activity? To drive them out of the land. to purge the land of this incredible sin. This is what God wanted Israel to do. So in terms, how does that relate to us? If any such thing is occurring in us, it cannot go unaddressed. It has to be fully addressed. So I'm not going to go further than that with this particular commandment, but you understand what I'm saying. Let's move on. Let's pick another one. I'm going to cherry pick chapter 24, verse 5. When a man takes a new wife, this is given that man can have more than one wife. Not with us, but in ancient Israel. When a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army, nor be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, and shall give happiness to his wife, whom he has taken. So there now, God is being considerate of the relationship between the husband and the wife. A marriage is very important to God. A marriage, in its proper context, can glorify God and should glorify God. So, for this reason, the man of Israel is not to go out to war. He's to stay home and anchor his relationship with his new wife. Give her happiness, give her joy, and that's to be done for a period of a year. So you see there God's determination. And what does this have to do? It has to do with orderly community living. It's important that a marriage be properly grounded. And when a marriage is properly grounded, you escape the possibilities of adultery, abuse, and all of the other things that comes with a marriage not being well grounded. Also, let's cherry pick one more, chapter 24, verse 14. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your countrymen or one of your aliens, who is in the land and in your tongues, who is in your land and in your tongues. So this has to do with showing compassion upon the alien, the foreigner in your midst. You're not to reject the foreigner, but you ought to lift them up, right? And treat them as one of your countrymen, and not treat them from a standpoint of being a people rejected. All right, this is a tendency in all communities, I think. If there's a foreigner in your midst, you tend to want to treat them differently. That's natural. God is saying to Israel, don't do it. Don't treat the foreigner any different than the natural son. Let's pick another one, just verse 17, chapter 24. You shall not pervert justice, due an alien or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment in pledge. All right, so don't take the clothes off of a widow's back. Be compassionate. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. Be considerate of the foreigners who are servants in your community, because you were also servants or slaves when you were in Egypt. So you begin to see here a pattern in regards to the mitzvot, right? God is considering, God is laying out consideration for the entire community so that the community can function in an orderly way, in such a way as to glorify God. That's the purpose of the mitzvot. Also, chapter 24, verse 21, we'll read that particular mitzvah. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. What does that mean? What does that mean? When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. Go over what? The vineyard. To make sure that you didn't miss any. And that's what he's getting at. Go over it again. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. All right. Again, what is the point to that? The point is, of course, to remember the orphan, the widow, the alien, to keep them satisfied in your community. If you have a field of wheat and you've harvested the field of wheat, leave some for the foreigner that will come. It's again, it all points to the necessity for proper communal existence, living as a community in such a way as to glorify God. All right, there are many more mitzvot that we can look at. Let's just pick one more, just to be random. Let's pick one more. Chapter 24, verse 10 to 13. Just one more, just to clear this up for us. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, when you loan some money out of any sort, you shall not enter his house to take his pledge. In other words, if you loan some money to someone and they're late in payment, you don't bust into their house. You don't stop them on the road, pull them over, and say, hey, where's my money? You shall remain outside of the man, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. If he is a poor man, you shall not sleep with his pledge. If he's a poor man, you shall not sleep with his pledge. I'm not quite sure what that means, but hey, if you have any understanding on that, maybe you can fill me in. Let's read it again, verse 12. If he is a poor man, you shall not sleep with his pledge.
You don't take money from the poor.
Sleep with his
Don't borrow
pledge?
money to someone who's poor and unable to pay it back.
Not sure why sleep with his pledge there is. All right, verse 13. When the sun goes down, you shall surely return the pledge to him. Now it makes sense. That he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it will be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. So verse 13 cleared it up pretty much. Literally, you shall not sleep with the pledge. If he's a poor man, give it to him. Give him back the pledge. So that's interesting. So you see, God is considerate throughout these mitzvot. He's considerate of the less fortunate. Considerate of the less fortunate. There are some commandments in here that are very stark, and they're able to be mocked even by presidents, right? So there's a few in here like that. But keep in mind again, what is the reason for these mitzvot? Is so that the people of Israel will remain a holy people, a people for God's own purpose, and that they would effectively carry out the mission that God has appointed them to. Sometimes we fail to see that big picture concerning Israel, who they were in that context and who they are today. Israel is still the people today that they were 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago. God has called Israel to be his weapon, his war club. And that's consistent throughout the Bible. Now, concerning war, Israel being God's war club, there's one more commandment that we're going to look at tonight. It has to do with something that occurred in Exodus chapter 17, and we'll go back and look at that. This is a different type of a commandment. It's more involved. It requires more commitment on behalf of Israel. Let's read this other commandment. It's in chapter 25, verse 17 to 19. It's the very end of tonight's Torah portion. Let's read it. Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. Who's Amalek? Amalek? All right, Amalek, a people demonically charged by the evil one to invariably come against God's purpose and God's people. That's one way you can define Amalek, and I think it's a safe way to do it. Amalek is an ongoing enemy of God and his people. Wherever God's people are, you will invariably find Amalek not too far away. Amalek quite frequently would exist within the context of a congregation of believers. I've seen it. I know it. I know it's a reality. Wherever God's people are, and God is thriving through a body of people, Amalek is not far off. Amalek is always looking for an opportunity to undermine, to cut away at what God is doing, to criticize what God is doing, and to come against it. Usually, Amalek begins to function unseen, almost invisible. But then after some time, you give Amalek a few months, Amalek becomes very exposed. And it becomes very obvious that that particular person or people are functioning in the spirit of Amalek. Again, wherever God is thriving through his people, you will find Amalek. He's never far off. And in this context, we're talking about what happened with Israel as God had began to bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, out of bondage, in preparation for this great mission. Amalek attacks. Let's read. Again, verse 17. Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt, how he met you along the way and attacked among you all the stragglers at your rear, when you were faint and weary, and he did not fear God. So what did Amalek do? Amalek went after the weak, the frail. Israel was in transition to Mount Sinai. They were people that were on a journey, and Amalek comes from behind and attacks. Stragglers, the weak, the women and the children. And this was particularly, how should I say it? This was particularly grieving to God. It certainly warranted God's wrath. And we're going to go back to Exodus chapter 17 and read about that in a moment. Now, verse 19. Therefore it shall come about when the Lord your God has given you rest from all the surrounding enemies in the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You must not forget. This is a commandment. God is laying a charge. Remember, the word zavah is the root word of commandment or mitzvah. God is laying a charge upon the people of Israel to abolish Amalek. When? When they have abolished all their other enemies. In other words, leave Amalek for last. And when you've done what you're supposed to do, push all of the Canaanites out of the land, obliterate them and their paganism, get after Amalek. This is the commandment. Now, God is a jealous God and does not take lightly when evil thrives against him and against his purpose. So in regards to Amalek, again, the spirit of Amalek is very much alive today. Avi Lipkin talked about Islam on Tuesday night. Islam is, on a very broad scale, the spirit of Amalek. Amalek is alive and well in Islam. Amalek also exists in regards to geopolitics. Right? We talk a lot about the beast, the world system. Well, that's Amalek. It's nothing short of Amalek. If, in fact, there are conspiracies attached to this virus and the vaccines thereof, then that's Amalek. No question, that is Amalek. Amalek is always there to undermine what God is doing and to strive against God's people. So this is all Amalek. Now, what did God say to Israel in regards to Amalek? To blot out Amalek. Now, ultimately, Israel would fail in this regard. What happened? The Amalekites were not destroyed completely. We know the story of Saul, King Saul. What happened? He had an opportunity to do this exact thing, to blot out the Amalekites for once and for all. And he compromised. He acquiesced to the wishes of the people, which were, don't kill out the Amalekites, not all of them. Keep the ladies. Keep the honored men in the camp of Amalek. Keep the cattle. Why destroy all of the cattle? Because God said that you should, but no, we don't need to do this. And ultimately there was a compromise, and we know the rest of the story. Okay. Now, what is it about Amalek that has grieved God so completely that God is determined, and he's commanding Israel to never forget that you must blot out Amalek. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 17. We read this when we got to that place in the Torah portion. Perhaps I didn't spend a lot of time in there, but we'll spend a little more time there tonight. Not too much. So in Exodus chapter 17, I'm going to read 8 to 16. Then Amalek came, fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek tomorrow. I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua did, as Moses told him, and fought against Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses' hand fell limp, right, that Israel prevailed. And when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. When they took the stone, then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. He's holding up a staff for hours until sunset. Aaron and Hur supported him in the process. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. So Joshua prevailed because Moses held up the staff of God. When he was tired and his hands were descending, Aaron and Hur stood there and held up his hands so that the battle would be decisively won. And there was victory, right? So Amalek is defeated at that point. But listen to what God says. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. So Moses built an altar and named it, The Lord is my banner. And he said, the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. So even though Amalek was defeated there, God said that he will continue to have conflict with Amalek from generation to generation. Usually when you see that phrase in the Bible, generation to generation, it's effectively relating to eternity throughout all the ages. So God's going to have war with Amalek throughout the ages. The Hebrew here says something a little different than what's in your Bible. It basically says, because Amalek has placed his hand on the throne of God. So what does that mean? Amalek placed his hand on the throne of God. What does that mean? It simply means that Amalek challenged God, challenged his authority. What was God doing? He was bringing his people into his grand purpose for the land of Israel, for the people of Israel, and for the Canaanites. This is something that God had planned for a very long time, at least 400 years. This is something that God had established a covenant for. Remember Genesis chapter 15. God had cut that covenant with Abraham, and at that time had announced that this would be the actions that I will take through your descendants. I will bring them in to the land, and I will use them to rid the land of the Canaanites. So God had planned for this event for a long time. Here comes Amalek, effectively the spirit of Hasatan, the opposer, and attacks Israel from behind. This was incredibly offensive to God, and God made that statement, that he will make war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, who was Amalek? What was the demographic of the people of Amalek? Who were they? Well, from everything I've seen, and I've done a little research on this, but from everything I've seen, Amalek was an amalgamation of different peoples who worshipped the god Molech. They were not one demographic of people. Now, Edom, his name is Edom, his descendants became the Edomites. Esau had a son whose name was Amalek. What does Amalek mean? Amalek. the people of Molech. So, Amalek are a people who worship and serve the god Molech. What do we know about the god Molech? You sacrifice your babies to the god Molech. Why do you do it? You do it for fame, notoriety, for riches, and for honor. And this is how the pagans worshipped Amalek. Amalek was a bit distinct from the Canaanite gods. The Canaanites did worship Amalek, but not as a demographic of Canaanites. They were a mixed bunch of many different peoples. In other words, the Gibeonites, the Jebusites, from time to time would leave the ites and go join the Amalekites and become a part of Amalek, worshiping the god Molech. And this remained intact throughout the existence of Israel and the land of Israel. In fact, before Jerusalem was destroyed, Manasseh, one of the sons of David, had built a Molech right there in the Kidron Valley. Had built an altar to Molech right there, almost a stone's throw away from the temple, if you can throw really far. So a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago or so, they found the remains of the Molech right there in the Kidron Valley, testifying to the reality that Manasseh, that king, did build a Molech right there in Jerusalem. So you see, this is the most heinous type of worship, an abomination to God. I think Amalek, or Molech, I should say, is sort of a representation of Hasatan himself. So if you serve Molech, you serve the evil one himself. Now I say that not just because Molech is a grievous figure, but because the attributes that we see God given to Molech are sort of like those that are given to the enemy himself. I will make war with Amalek from generation to generation. God is preparing to put an end to Amalek when there are no more generations. When will there be no more generations? At the end of the millennial kingdom. There will be generations following after each other during the millennial kingdom. At the end of the millennial kingdom, there are no more generations. All right? That's the final generation. Now, that's exactly, I believe, when God will put an end to Amalek once and for all. That representation of Amalek is referred to as Gog and Magog, or Gog of Magog. Final manifestation of Amalek that will consolidate his power, his forces, and strive against the people of Israel and the people of God. And that's when God puts an end to Amalek once and for all. That's when everything is destroyed. Isaiah saw this and he said, "Behold, I make all things new, a new heaven and new earth. All things are done away with." In that process of doing away with all things, God is going to do away with Amalek once and for all. What happens to the evil one, Satan himself, and his minion, at the end of the millennial kingdom? It says it there in Revelation chapter 20, I think it's in verse 11 or 12, that Satan is thrown into the lake of fire. And that's the end of Amalek. There is no more opportunities for Amalek to ever thrive against God's people. God is making war with Amalek. He's preparing to put an end to Amalek. But it is a commandment. I want you to see that. It is a commandment given to Israel to make war against Amalek, to destroy Amalek. Now, Amalek is still on the scene, very much on the scene. When I think about the great evil that's evident in this age, and evil is pretty intense. Evil has built for itself a fortress that's working against humanity. This is Amalek. Amalek has conspired with humanity to bring about this end. And it's a horrible ending. What Amalek is planning. I don't believe Amalek will have his way. I don't believe his little conspiracy will come to fruition. I am convinced that it wouldn't, actually. God will intervene, and he will intervene with such force that Amalek will not have a chance. So that's something that we need to consider. That Israel has a commandment, one of the 613 commandments, laws and statutes, to make war against Amalek. What about us? Do we have such a commandment to make war against Amalek? What do you think? Huh? Okay. Right? So what Anna Mary said was relative to Moses standing on the mountaintop, holding up the staff of God, Aaron and Hur on either side of him. What did they represent? We believe, as we've said many times around here, that we believe that Moses in the office of Messiah is symbolically representing what the church is, or what the church will be at the end of the age. Now, it's Christ in us, it's Jesus in us. The church in and of itself would not be able to ascend that mountaintop. The church, that church, the remnant church, will only make it up that mountaintop because of Jesus. Because all power and authority has been given unto him. That power and authority is the staff of God that Yeshua Jesus holds up before the enemy. But we're to hold that up as well. We're to hold that up as well. Okay, so how do we do it? Practically speaking, what does that look like? Well, our prayer meetings are overflowing with people who are not afraid to address in the spirit realm Amalek. I'll say it again. Our prayer meetings are overflowing with people who are not afraid in the spirit to address Amalek. Now, let me guarantee you one thing here real quickly. If you're not fully committed to the kingdom, don't try it. Don't try to engage on this level if you've got little things that you haven't dealt with. Little foxes. Deal with those little foxes. Deal with those things that can prevent you, can hold you back, before you determine to get on this level of warfare. But ultimately, folks, the church, the remnant church, the church that will actually stand and be effective against Amalek will take its position. Will do it. It will happen. When God intervenes, this mess that Amalek is preparing for humanity, God will intervene. It's going to be shocking when he does. It's going to be a time in human history unlike any other time when God intervenes. And he's going to intervene powerfully. Namely, the sixth seal and the seven trumpets. That's God's intervention. That's when he stops Amalek dead in his tracks. There's a wonderful handful of verses, 3 or 4 verses in Revelation chapter 8, that talks about the saints offering up prayer. And as they are offering up prayer incense, fire comes down from heaven. So you see there's a correlation between the prayer of the saints and God's intervention. Revelation chapter 8. I really have to go look at it, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I am teaching on prophecy on Sundays, and I'm going to touch on that either this Sunday or the following Sunday, more than likely the following Sunday. That yes, there will come a time when Amalek would strut his stuff, and he will believe that he's this close to accomplishing his purpose, which is destruction of God's creation, complete subjugation of God's creation. They're not far off, they believe, and they will execute and keep executing until they get there. But suddenly God intervenes, and it's powerful when he does. Those trumpets, powerful. But right at that time, the saints are on the planet, in this world, and our prayer is effectual towards the intervention of God. Now, you'll see it when we get there. You'll see it. It's in the book of Revelation. Now, that's who we are. We, in effect, have a commandment from God to not allow Amalek to exist. We do. We absolutely do. Now, in terms of congregational life, Amalek is not ever to be comfortable here. Amalek will come in. Invariably, Amalek will slip in. Amalek is a spirit. Someone will bring him in. Invariably, I've seen it many, many times. Now, if I'm asleep on the wheel, or the elders are asleep on the wheel, well, Amalek will fester, I should say, and before long you have a little bit of Amalek over here, a little bit of Amalek over there, and Amalek is consolidating his efforts to come against God. If we're asleep on the wheel. If we're not asleep on the wheel, and we're faithful with our watch, Amalek will not have a chance. Not in God's house. And in that way, we make war against Amalek. All right? And so Amalek is real. Amalek is a real and present threat to humanity and to God's people. How many, let's say, churches, how many churches succumb to Amalek? It happens on a regular basis. It does. Whenever you hear of a pastor, for instance, committing adultery, Amalek. Whenever you hear of a pastor stealing from the church and running off with large sums of money, have you ever heard of that? Yeah, that's Amalek. Whenever you hear about a Jezebel infiltrating the church and gaining possession of that church, that's Amalek. Jezebel in the Bible was an almost perfect representation of Amalek. Yes, she was. So you see, folks, we have an enemy. We have a real enemy and a real conflict. And we have a commandment from God to not allow Amalek to exist. Ultimately, with God's intervention and help, Amalek will be completely destroyed. And you know what? I'm really looking forward to that. I've had it up to here with Amalek. Really. I'm done with Amalek. I think God is as well. So they're planning their stuff, you know, and they're becoming so blatant about it, Amalek, they're becoming so blatant about it, unable to hide their intentions anymore. That's good. That's good, because they're being exposed. They're being exposed, and that can only mean one thing: their end is near. God's preparing to put an end to Amalek, and praise God for that. So there's such, in my mind, there's such assuredness and comfort in knowing that the enemy that opposes us is God's enemy. Let me say it again. The one who threatens us is actually God's enemy. Is there comfort in that? Is there? Do you take comfort in knowing that your enemy, the one who wants to destroy you, is also God's enemy? You should take comfort in it. God's enemy has no chance. You know, I often think about the battle of Armageddon, or the battle of Gog and Magog. It's not going to be much of a battle. No, it's not going to be much of a battle. It's going to be a wash. The enemy will not have a chance, not even a remote chance. So I take joy in knowing that my enemy is God's enemy. And I stand in that confidence that that enemy will not prevail against me, will not prevail against the church. He will do everything he can to gain that victory, but he will fail. He'll be defeated. All right, but we do have a commandment. It is there, a mitzvah, to make war against Amalek. Because God is making war against Amalek. And his authority is in us. We hold up the staff of God. When we do, Amalek has no chance. No chance. So, Shabbat Shalom.